The warning came 12 days after leaving Marker 7 when the ship's sensors detected a vessel following them through the darkness between stars. Captain Morell called all senior passengers to the bridge, and Valisaya went as the leader of the refugee delegation, and Junwoo followed as her claimed. The captain was a weathered human woman with gray hair and tired eyes, and she had seen too much in her decades of hauling cargo through dangerous space. She showed them the sensor readings and explained what they meant. A Keth warship had been tracking them since the way station, and it was faster than the Wandering Promise, and it would catch them within 2 days. The ship carried enough firepower to destroy the transport several times. Over and there would be no negotiation and no mercy. The Keth leader from the station had kept his promise, and he had called in reinforcements, and now he was coming to collect what he wanted. Valisaya's chitin darkened the black in her compound. Eyes reflected the sensor display with terrible clarity. Her guards numbered only 8, and they were loyal and skilled, but they could not fight a warship. The captain asked if there was anything the Queen could offer to make the Keth go away, and Valisaya shook her head. They wanted her children, and she would die before allowing that, and her guards would die beside her. Junwoo stood at the back of the bridge and listened to this conversation, and watched these people prepare to fight a battle they could not win. He thought about the larvae in the cargo hold and how they had crawled across his lap and made curious sounds and trusted him completely. He thought about Valisaya and how she had trembled when asking him to join her hive and how she checked on her children every few hours. He thought about the Keth and how they had beaten him and how they had looked at those children like products to be sold. And then he had an idea. It was not a good idea by any reasonable measure, but it was the only one he had. He asked the captain if he could use the ship's communication system for a few hours, and she stared at him like he had lost his mind. Valisaya asked what he intended to do, and Junwoo explained humans could not outfight the Keth, and that was simply a fact of the galaxy. But humans moved goods everywhere in human cargo networks. Connected systems across dozens of sectors, and human trade ships visited Keth ports every single day. If those human networks decided to stop doing business with the Keth, then Keth operations in the entire region would collapse within weeks. He was not suggesting they threaten the Keth with military force, because that would be stupid and suicidal. He was suggesting they threaten them with economics. The captain laughed, but it was not a mocking laugh. And it was the laugh of someone who suddenly saw an unexpected path through impossible circumstances. She gave Junwoo access to the communications array and left him to work. Junwoo started making calls, and he reached out to every human cargo handler and trader and shipping company. He had worked with over 15 years in the business. He explained the situation in simple terms without exaggeration or drama. A Keth warship was about to attack a refugee transport to harvest children for the illegal biotech market. If this attack succeeded, then Keth slavers would know they could target any ship carrying valuable cargo, and no one would stop them. But if human trade networks announced a complete embargo against any Keth vessels or stations in the sector, then the Keth would have to calculate whether a few larvae were worth losing their entire logistics infrastructure. The first responses came slowly, and some people told him he was crazy, and others said it was not their problem, and others simply did not answer. But a few said yes. Those few contacted others who contacted others who contacted others. Within 6 hours, a coalition of human free traders representing over 300 vessels had signed a joint declaration. Any attack on the Wandering Promise would result in immediate suspension of all human shipping services to Keth-controlled space for a minimum of 1 standard year. The declaration went out on every frequency the Keth warship could receive. Then they waited. Junwoo sat on the bridge beside Valisaya and watched the sensor display and tried not to think about what would happen if his plan failed. Queen asked him how he had convinced so many humans to risk their livelihoods for strangers they would never meet. Junwoo shrugged and said humans were strange creatures. They formed connections across distances that made no logical sense, and they remembered favors and debts and relationships that spanned decades. He had helped a lot of people over the years, and now he was calling in those favors. Velethsia studied him with those compound eyes, and said her people did not work then. Waveleth formed hives and served their queens, and that was the extent of their social bonds. The idea of humans scattered across the galaxy, but still connected by invisible threads of obligation and friendship confused her. Junwoo told her that humans were pack animals who had somehow spread across the stars, but never lost the instinct to look after each other. It did not always work, and sometimes humans failed each other badly. But when it mattered, and when the stakes were high enough, they could still come together. The sensor display changed and everyone on the bridge held their breath. The Keth warship had stopped accelerating, and it was holding position at the edge of sensor range. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then, the warship turned and began moving away, and within an hour it had disappeared from sensors entirely. The captain slumped in her chair and laughed with relief and shook her head in disbelief. She told Junwoo that she had seen many things in her years of flying cargo ships, but she had never seen someone win a battle with trade agreements. Junwoo felt the tension drain from his body and exhaustion rushed in to fill the space it left behind. Velethsia reached out and took his hand in hers, and her smooth fingers wrapped around his calloused palm. She said nothing, but the gesture carried more meaning than words could express. 3 days passed before Junwoo could sit up without gasping from the pain in his ribs, and during that time, the Veleth healers visited him constantly. They brought strange medicines that smelled like flowers and copper, and they applied treatments he did not understand, but which seemed to work better than anything humans had invented. The private cabin was far nicer than any space a cargo handler could afford, and it had soft lighting and climate control, and a bed that adjusted itself to his body. He asked the healers how he had ended up in such luxury, and they simply told him the queen had ordered it, and that her word was law among their people. On the 4th day, Velethsia came to see him, and she wore different clothes now gone. Were the plain robes of a common worker, and in their place she wore garments that shimmered with colors he could not name and patterns that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. She looked like what she was, and that was a monarch. In exile, but still a monarch. She sat in a chair beside his bed and studied him with those compound eyes that reflected light in strange ways. She asked if he was feeling better, and he told her yes, and thanked her for the medical care. Then she told him they needed to discuss what had happened and what would happen next. Junwoo felt a knot form in his stomach because important conversations with royalty rarely ended well for people like him. Velethsia explained that her people had laws older than human civilization and traditions that governed every aspect of their society. One such tradition concerned debts of blood and suffering and the obligations created when one being sacrificed themselves for another. She told him that what he had done by taking the beating meant for her children had created a bond that could not be ignored under Veleth law. Such sacrifice demanded recognition, and there were only 2 possible responses according to ancient custom. The first option was execution, because a being capable of such devotion could be dangerous if they ever turned against the hive. Junwoo felt his heart skip at those words, but Velethsia raised a hand to calm him. She explained that this option applied only when the protector was deemed a threat, and clearly he was not. The second option was claiming, and this meant integration into the hive structure as one who belonged to the queen herself. Junwoo frowned and asked what exactly that meant in practical terms. Velethsia seemed to search for words that would make sense to a human mind. She explained that claiming was similar to adoption, but also similar to swearing an oath of service, but also similar to becoming family. It was all of these things at once, and none of them exactly. A claimed being would receive the protection of the queen and her hive. and would hold status above common workers, but below blood relatives. They would be bound to the queen's household and expected to act in the hive's interests and would share in both triumphs and failures. Junwoo's drug-hazed mind tried to process this information and failed. He asked if this was like a job offer, and Velithia tilted her head in a gesture he was beginning to recognize as amusement. She said it was somewhat like employment, but the contract was for life and could not be easily broken. Junwoo thought about his current life and the endless cargo holds and the 12-hour shifts and the tiny bunk he shared with 2 other workers. He thought about how he had no family waiting for him anywhere and no real home to return to, and nothing that tied him to his old existence. He looked at Velithia and saw something in her eyes that surprised him. She was afraid of what he might say. This queen who commanded the loyalty of hundreds had just revealed herself to a stranger and asked him to become part of her world, and she was terrified he would refuse. Junwoo did not fully understand what he was agreeing to, but he understood loneliness, and he understood the need for people who would stand by you when everything fell apart. He told her yes, and that he accepted, and that he would be claimed, as she had described. Velithia closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, some of the tension had left her body. She reached out and touched his forehead with one smooth hand and spoke words in her own language that hummed with strange harmonics. Something passed between them, and it was not physical, but it was real. Junwoo felt it settle into his bones like warmth spreading through cold limbs. When she finished, she told him the ritual was complete and that he was now hive bonded to the Queen of the 13th. Ivy asked what happened next, and she smiled and said, "That was an excellent question." She explained that she was traveling to distant space, where allied hives had offered her sanctuary. She would rebuild her power base there and gather strength to eventually reclaim her throne. Junwoo would come with her household and learn the ways of her people and find his place among them. He realized suddenly that he had just changed his entire life based on a decision made while drugged and confused. But somehow he did not regret it. The following days brought new experiences as Junwoo recovered enough to move around the ship. Other species treated him differently now, and he noticed it immediately. The looks he received ranged from respectful to suspicious to openly hostile. A human bonded to a Velith queen was unprecedented in living memory. Some saw it as a political statement, and others saw it as a sign of desperation, and others simply did not know what to make of it. The Velith of Velithia's retinue accepted him cautiously, and they spoke to him politely, but kept their distance. Only the larvae showed no hesitation, and they crawled toward him whenever he visited and made small sounds that their caretakers translated as curiosity. Junwoo sat with the children and let them examine his strange soft skin and his bizarre flat eyes and his weird flexible hands. They seemed fascinated by how different he was from everything they knew. He told them stories about Earth and about oceans and mountains and forests, and they listened with the intense focus that only the very young could achieve. Velithia watched these interactions, and her compound eyes held an expression he could not read. She told him once that her children had never shown such interest in an outsider before. Junwoo shrugged and said children were the same everywhere, regardless of species. They wanted someone to pay attention to them and make them feel safe. The queen was silent for a long moment after that, and then she nodded slowly and said perhaps humans understood some things her own people had forgotten. The first blow came without warning, and it knocked Junwoo sideways into the corridor wall with enough force to make his vision flash white. He tasted blood in his mouth and felt something crack in his chest, but he pushed himself back to standing, because the Velith woman still held those larvae behind him, and the Keth still wanted them. The Keth leader looked almost amused, and he told his soldiers to teach this human what happened to those who interfered with their business. 2 of them grabbed Junwoo by the arms and held him upright, while the third drove a fist into his stomach, and the air left his lungs in one painful rush. He sagged in their grip, but he did not cry out, and he did not beg them to stop. The beating continued in a systematic way, and the Keth took turns, and they knew exactly how to cause pain without killing, and they had clearly done this many times before. Junwoo lost count of the blows after the first dozen, and his body became a map of agony, and every breath felt like fire in his chest. Blood ran from his nose and his split lip, and a cut above his eye, and it dripped onto the deck in small red patterns. But every time they let him fall, he got back up again. His legs shook and his hands trembled. But he stood between the Keth and the Veleth, and he did not move aside. The refugees watched in stunned silence, and some of them looked away, because they could not bear to see what was happening to this human who had chosen to suffer for strangers. The important Veleth woman stood frozen with the larvae pressed against her, and her compound eyes reflected the violence unfolding before her, and she did not understand what she was seeing. Humans were supposed to be weak and selfish and concerned only with their own survival, according to everything her people had been taught. This made no sense. One of the Keth soldiers grew tired of the game, and he drew back his fist for a blow that would surely shatter bone and end this stubborn human once and for all. But before he could strike, a sharp alarm blared through the corridor, and station security officers appeared at the entrance with weapons drawn. The lead officer was a tall creature with blue-scaled skin, and she shouted at them, Keth, to stand down immediately, and she reminded them that violence in the passenger areas violated station protocol. The Keth leader turned to face her and argued that they were simply conducting business and that this human had interfered with a legitimate transaction. But the security officer shook her head and said she did not care about their business, and she only cared that they were making noise and causing problems and disturbing the other customers. She told them to leave or face fines and penalties that would eat into their profits. The Keth exchanged glances, and their leader made a disgusted sound in his throat. He stepped close to Junwoo, who somehow remained standing despite everything, and he spoke softly so only the human could hear. He said this was not over, and that they would be waiting, and that eventually this ship would have to leave the station, and then there would be no security to save anyone. Then he turned and led his soldiers away, and they disappeared into the crowded corridors of Marker 7. Security officer looked at Junwoo and shook her head and muttered something about stupid humans before she and her team moved on to handle other problems. Junwoo stood alone in the corridor, and his body screamed with pain, and his legs finally gave out, and he collapsed to the deck. The world went gray and distant, and he heard voices around him, but could not make out the words. Hands touched him, and they were not human hands, and they felt smooth and cool like polished stone. Someone lifted him and carried him, and he tried to protest, but his voice came out as nothing more than a weak moan. The Veleth woman walked beside whoever carried him, and she issued commands in her own language. And her voice had changed somehow, and it carried authority and power that had been hidden before. Other Veleth moved quickly to obey her, and they cleared a path through the refugee section and opened a door to a private cabin that Junwoo had not known existed. They placed him on a soft bed, and someone pressed a medical injector against his neck, and the pain began to fade into a warm, comfortable haze. Junwoo looked up at the ceiling and tried to remember how he had ended up here, and why everything hurt so much. The Veleth woman appeared above him, and her compound eyes studied his battered face with an expression he could not read. She spoke to him in common speech, and her voice was gentle but firm. She asked him why he had done what he did and why he had suffered for children who were not his own and not even his species. Junwoo thought about the question, and his drugged mind wandered through memories of his childhood and the people who had protected him when no one else would, and the debts he could never repay. He told her that someone had to stand between the helpless and those who would hurt them, and that he had seen those larvae and known they were just children, and that children deserve protection, no matter what they looked like. She was silent for a long moment. Then she told him her name was Velasaya, and that she was not a simple refugee worker, as she had pretended to be. She was a queen of the 13th. Hive and those larvae were her children, and she had been forced to flee her world when enemies overthrew her rule. Junwoo blinked at her, and the drugs made it hard to think, but he managed to say that queens should probably mention that sort of thing before someone got beaten. For them, the Lethsia made a sound that might have been laughter, and she touched his forehead with one smooth hand and told him to rest now. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, and his last thought was that he hoped the children were safe. When he woke again, hours had passed and the ship had left. Marker 7 behind, and his body still hurt, but the worst of the damage had been treated. A Veleth healer sat beside his bed and explained that they had used their best medicines on him and that he would recover fully given time and rest. Junwoo asked where the queen was, and the healer told him she would come soon and that there were matters to discuss. He did not like the sound of that, but he was too tired to worry about it now. He stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into and whether he would regret stepping in front of those Kef soldiers. But when he thought about those small pale larvae and the fear in their caretaker's eyes, he knew he would make the same choice again. Some things were worth getting beaten for. Park Junwoo wiped the sweat from his forehead and pushed another cargo container into place inside the transport ship's hold, feeling his muscles ache from 12 hours of continuous work that never seemed to end no matter how hard he pushed himself. The vessel was called the Wandering Promise, and it carried everything from machine parts to medical supplies across the disputed territories of the Outer Rim, where law was more of a suggestion than a rule. But this trip was different because they also carried passengers, and not just any passengers, but refugees fleeing from a world that had fallen to conquerors. Just 3 weeks ago, Junwoo had seen them board at the last station, and he had watched them huddle together in the lower passenger deck where the air recyclers hummed too loud and the lights flickered every few minutes. Most of them were Veleth, and he had never worked alongside their kind before this journey. They stood taller than humans with bodies covered in smooth chitin that shifted colors depending on their mood, and their faces held compound eyes that seemed to look everywhere at once. The Veleth moved in groups, and they rarely spoke to other species, and they kept to themselves in ways that made the other passengers nervous. But Junwoo had noticed something else about them, and it was the way they protected the smallest members of their group. There were larvae among them, and these tiny creatures looked nothing like the adults, and they were soft and pale and barely the size of a human child's arm. The adult Veleth surrounded these little ones constantly, and they took turns carrying them and feeding them and shielding them from the stares of curious passengers. One Veleth, in particular, caught Junwoo's attention, and she was different from the others somehow. She wore the same plain robes as the workers around her, and she kept her head down, and she never spoke above a whisper. But the other Veleth watched her constantly. They looked to her before making decisions, and they stepped aside when she moved, and they angled their bodies to keep her hidden from outside. Junwoo recognized protection when he saw it because he had grown up in places where people learned to shield what mattered most from those who would take it. He did not know who she was, but he knew she was important. The Wandering Promise dropped out of faster-than-light travel near a way station called Marker 7, and the captain announced they would stop for fuel and supplies for approximately 6 hours. Junwoo welcomed the break because his back hurt and his hands were raw, and he wanted nothing more than to find a quiet corner and sleep. But the way station made him uneasy as soon as he saw it through the cargo bay's small viewport. Marker 7 hung in space like a tumor, and it was built from salvaged ship parts and stolen station modules, and it flew no flag of any government or alliance. Places like this existed in the gaps between civilizations, and they survived by asking no questions and keeping no records. The captain's voice came through the speakers again and warned all passengers to stay aboard during the refueling stop, and Junwoo heard the tension in that warning. Something was wrong here, and everyone could feel it. He finished securing the last of the cargo containers and made his way toward the passenger deck because he wanted to check on the water recycler he had promised to fix for the refugees yesterday. The corridor was narrow and dim, and he had to squeeze past crew members heading the other direction, and everyone moved with the quick, nervous energy of people who wanted to be somewhere else. When he reached the refugee section, he found the Velith clustered even tighter than before, and their chitin had darkened to a deep, worried purple. The important one stood at the center of the group, and she held two of the larvae against her chest, and her compound eyes tracked every movement in the corridor. Junwoo raised his hands to show he meant no harm, and he spoke softly and told her he was just the cargo worker here to fix the water system. She stared at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once and stepped aside, just enough to let him pass. He worked on the recycler while trying to ignore the heavy silence around him, and the Velith watched his every move, but they did not speak. The sound of boots in the corridor made everyone freeze, and these were not the soft steps of crew members or passengers. These boots hit the floor with purpose and authority, and they belonged to people who expected others to move out of their way. Junwoo looked up from his work and saw them enter the refugee section, and his stomach dropped. Keth soldiers stood at the entrance, and there were 5 of them, and they were massive creatures with gray, leathery skin and tusks that curved up from their lower jaws. The Keth were known throughout the Outer Rim as slavers and raiders, and they operated with impunity in places like Marker 7, where no law could touch them. Their leader stepped forward, and his eyes swept across the huddled refugees like a merchant examining livestock at market. He pointed at the Velith group and said something in his own language, and then switched to common speech so everyone could understand. He wanted to see the larvae, and he had heard there were royal young aboard this vessel, and such creatures would fetch a very high price from certain buyers who paid well for rare biological specimens. The Velith pressed closer together, and the important one backed away with the larvae still clutched against her body, and her chitin had gone almost black with fear. Junwoo stood up slowly from his crouch by the water recycler, and his heart pounded against his ribs. The Keth soldiers laughed at the cowering refugees, and their leader took another step forward and reached out one massive clawed hand toward the larvae. Junwoo did not think about what he did next, and his body simply moved on its own. He stepped between the Keth leader and the Velith woman, and he planted his feet on the deck, and he looked up at the creature that towered over him by nearly 2 feet. The laughter stopped, and the Keth stared down at the small human who had somehow appeared in his path. Junwoo heard his own voice speaking, and it sounded calmer than he felt, and he told the Keth that these larvae were registered cargo under human merchant law, and that any attempt to take them would be reported to the Human Trade Commission. It was a lie, and a desperate one at that, but it was all he had. The Keth leader tilted his massive head and studied Junwoo with eyes that held no warmth and no mercy, and only a cold, calculating hunger behind him. The Velith woman made a small sound, and it might have been surprise or confusion or something else entirely. The Keth leader smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, and he asked Junwoo if he really thought such a pathetic lie would protect these creatures. Junwoo did not move, and he did not look away, and he said, yes, because sometimes a lie was all that stood between the helpless and those who would hurt them. The Keth stopped, smiling,